Fallujah, March 31st, 2004. By then, the Iraq War had already entered a different phase. The initial invasion had been fast. The collapse of Saddam Hussein's government had been fast. The images of statues falling had been fast. But what came after was slower, darker, harder to define. Because removing a regime was one thing, controlling what replaced it was something else entirely. And in cities like Fallujah, what replaced it was not order. It was anger, suspicion, humiliation, and the steady rise of an insurgency that was learning very quickly how to fight a stronger enemy. Years later, most Americans would remember Fallujah through one image: a bridge, burning vehicles, crowds in the street, and the mutilated bodies of 4 American contractors hanging over the Euphrates. It was one of the most shocking images of the entire Iraq War. An image so powerful that it changed the emotional temperature of the conflict almost overnight. But that image was the end of the story, not the beginning. To understand what happened in Fallujah that day, you have to understand what Fallujah had already become. And you also have to understand the strange world those 4 men were operating in. Because they were not conventional soldiers, they were not diplomats, they were not aid workers, and yet they existed somewhere in between all of those categories. They were private security contractors, former military men, armed professionals, men hired to move through a war zone and keep other people alive. By 2004, that role had become deeply embedded in Iraq. The US military was carrying enormous burdens. Bases had to be supplied. Officials had to be protected. Convoys had to move. Contractors had to keep working. And wherever there was movement through Iraq, there was risk. Sometimes immediate risk, sometimes invisible risk, sometimes the kind of risk that looked ordinary, right up until the shooting started. That was the environment in which Blackwater had grown. The company had already built a reputation for speed, aggression, adaptability. To supporters, that made it effective. To critics, that made it dangerous. But either way, by early 2004, private contractors like Blackwater had become part of the machinery of the war itself. And in Iraq, machinery breaks down most easily when people assume they still have control. Fallujah was one of those places. At first glance, it was just another Iraqi city west of Baghdad. But by March of 2004, Fallujah was no ordinary city. It sat in the Sunni Triangle, a region where anti-coalition resistance was intensifying, a region where former regime elements, tribal networks, religious militants, and foreign fighters all had reasons to resist the new order. And Fallujah had already shown signs of what it was becoming. In April of 2003, US troops opened fire during unrest in the city, killing and wounding Iraqis. Soon after, insurgents shot down an American helicopter nearby. Local crowds reportedly celebrated around the wreckage. That mattered, because in war, cities develop reputations. And reputations affect everything. They affect how troops move, how contractors think, how civilians react, how commanders assess danger. By March of 2004, Fallujah had acquired the reputation of a place where things could go bad very quickly. At the same time, the broader war was changing. The invasion phase was over. The occupation phase was setting in, and a large rotation of American forces was underway. The 82nd Airborne, which had operated in the area, was being relieved by the 1st Marine Division. That meant handoffs, new faces, new responsibilities, and, as often happens in war, moments of transition. Transition creates seams, and seams create vulnerability. That same pattern existed in the contractor world. When military units rotated, contractor work rotated too. Food services, base logistics, transport, equipment, protection.
And this is where another layer enters the story. Because the men killed in Fallujah were not on some glamorous mission. They were not on a raid. They were not hunting high-value targets. They were escorting a logistics movement connected to support operations. That is one of the most important things about this story. So much of modern war depends not just on fighters, but on movement, food, fuel, supplies, kitchen equipment, vehicles, replacement gear. The unglamorous things. The things wars are actually built on. Around that time, a company called ESS was involved in support work linked to coalition logistics. It needed convoys moved in and out of dangerous areas west of Baghdad. Blackwater, through layers of subcontracting that ran through a Kuwaiti firm called Regency, took on the job of providing security for those movements. Even that arrangement says something about Iraq in 2004. This was not a simple battlefield with clear lines. It was a maze of contracts, subcontractors, overlapping authorities, and private firms operating inside an American war effort that had become far more outsourced than most people back home realized. That complexity matters, because when things go right, it feels efficient. When things go wrong, responsibility becomes harder to pin down. Who approved the mission? Who supplied the vehicles? Who was supposed to provide maps? Who made the final decision? Who accepted the risk? Those questions would haunt this case for years. But on March 31st, 2004, those questions had not yet become lawsuits and committee reports. They were still practical problems. And practical problems in war have consequences very quickly. The Blackwater team involved in the mission has often been referred to as Team November 1. There were 4 men: Wes Batalona, Scott Helvenston, Jerry Zovko, Mike Teague. All veterans, all men with backgrounds in demanding military roles. Men used to risk, men used to responsibility, men used to operating in places where hesitation could get people killed. That also matters, because it is easy, years later, to imagine them as symbols. But before they became symbols, they were professionals, and professionals in war learn to make peace with uncertainty. They understand that not every mission is ideal, not every plan arrives complete, not every vehicle is the one you wanted, not every route is the safest one. Very often, the real question is not whether conditions are perfect. The real question is whether conditions are survivable. That was the kind of judgment call these men were being asked to make. The assignment centered on movement near Camp Ridgeway, west of Fallujah. And from the beginning, there were concerns. According to later reporting and investigations, the team did not have the fully armored vehicles they expected. Instead, they were using Mitsubishi Pajeros with limited protection. Not the sort of protection men would have wanted for the most dangerous city in Iraq. There were also disputes over manpower. The contract language reportedly envisioned a minimum of 3 security personnel per vehicle in especially dangerous areas. That would mean 6 men for 2 vehicles. But on the mission that day, there were 4, to defenders of Blackwater. That did not automatically mean the mission was reckless. The argument from that side was simple. These were experienced men. They understood the risk.
They were not conscripts. They were not ordered in the military sense.
The team leader evaluated the situation and believed the assignment could be done if the convoy was reduced. And according to that account, he insisted on shrinking the movement dramatically, from a much larger number of trucks
down to just 3. That decision, in this reading, was not proof of recklessness. It was proof that he recognized the danger and tried to manage it. To critics, however, the same facts looked very different. They argued the mission moved too early, that the transition with the previous security provider had not been completed properly, that the men lacked proper maps, that there had not been enough time for reconnaissance or route familiarization, that the company was trying to prove it could perform quickly and efficiently in order to strengthen its position and impress the client. In that version, this was not just a dangerous mission. It was a badly prepared one, and that is where this story becomes strong documentary material, because both sides contain something real. In Iraq in 2004, dangerous missions were normal. That is true. Men did accept imperfect conditions all the time. That is also true. But it is equally true that in war, the line between acceptable risk and unacceptable preparation is often only visible after people die. That line is one of the central tensions in this story. The day before the ambush, the team staged through Camp Fallujah. That alone tells you the danger was understood. Nobody mistook this place for safe. At approximately 9 in the morning on March 31st, the team and the ESS trucks left the base and headed west. And before going further, it is worth stopping here, because this is the last calm moment in the story, the last point at which the mission still existed, only as a plan. The vehicles were moving, the roads were open, the city was ahead, and somewhere inside that city, other men were also making plans. That is one of the hardest things to grasp about convoy work in Iraq. There are always at least 2 timelines, the one you know and the one you do not. The route on your map and the route the enemy has already studied. The mission you think you are conducting and the trap someone else thinks you are entering. Fallujah by then was a city where insurgents watched. They watched uniforms, they watched vehicles, they watched habits, they understood roads and choke points, they understood where convoys slowed down, they understood how to weaponize the city itself. A narrow street can become a firing lane, a crowd can become cover, a traffic interruption can become a signal, a false sense of routine can become an opening. By some later accounts, insurgents may have known that Americans or foreign contractors would be coming through. There were suspicions that information had spread. There were claims that the route had effectively become a setup. What is certain is that once the convoy entered Fallujah, it was moving inside a city already primed for violence. And then, very quickly, it happened. The convoy was attacked. Gunfire erupted. The Blackwater vehicles were struck. The attack was sudden enough that, by some accounts, Helvenston and Teague had little or no real chance to respond before they were hit. The lead and trailing vehicles, designed to provide mutual protection, were overwhelmed in the first seconds of the assault. And within moments, what had started as a security mission became something else entirely. A collapse, not only of the convoy, but of control. That is another thing modern war punishes. People often imagine an ambush as a firefight, but the most effective ambushes are not really firefights, they are control stripping events. They happen so fast that the target does not regain the initiative, not in time. And in urban insurgency, that problem becomes worse, because once a convoy is disabled in a hostile city, the city itself begins to close in around it. Buildings become walls, roads become channels. Civilians become onlookers, onlookers become participants, and fear becomes momentum. By many accounts, there was little evidence of meaningful return fire from the contractors. That fact has been cited in different ways. Some see it as evidence that they were simply caught too suddenly. Others see it as proof of how vulnerable the team had been from the start. Either way, the effect was the same. The convoy was finished almost as soon as the ambush began, and then came the part that would define the event in global memory. Because in Fallujah, killing the men was not enough. The bodies were pulled from the vehicles, burned, dragged, mutilated, and then 2 of them were hung from a bridge over the Euphrates River.
Images of cheering crowds spread around the world. For Americans watching at home, it was not just horrifying, it was humiliating, and humiliation in war has strategic consequences, especially in democracies, especially on television, especially when the dead are Americans.
It is difficult to overstate the power of those images. Until then, many Americans had not understood how deeply private contractors had become embedded in the war. They may have known soldiers were fighting. They may have known diplomats were under protection. But this revealed another layer. Another class of Americans in the war zone, armed civilians, former military men, contractors doing jobs once assumed to belong to the state. For many viewers, this was the moment the privatized dimension of the Iraq War became visible. Not through policy, not through hearings, not through budgets, but through horror. And horror is what forces people to pay attention. Back in the United States, the families of the dead were trying to understand what had happened. Who had sent the men there? Why only 4 had gone? Why the vehicles were what they were? Why there had not been more information? Why Fallujah had been entered in the first place? Those questions would turn into lawsuits, and those lawsuits would turn the incident into a second battle, this time over responsibility. Critics of Blackwater argued that the men had been sent out without the protections promised, that they lacked proper armored vehicles, that manpower had been cut, that there had not been enough preparation, that the company wanted to demonstrate speed and competence to secure more business. Some Blackwater internal material later acknowledged that the team had no time for proper mission planning and did not have proper maps of the city. Those details became central to the case against the company. Blackwater pushed back forcefully. Its position was that stronger weapons, more armor, or different maps would not have changed the outcome. That the city was already a kill zone. That the attack had been overwhelming. That the team had not been murdered because of minor planning imperfections, but because they had entered one of the most hostile urban environments in Iraq at exactly the wrong moment. And again, both sides contain something that rings true. It is entirely possible for a mission to be both dangerous by nature and flawed in preparation. Those things are not mutually exclusive. That is one reason this story still matters. Because so many modern war stories are argued as if only one explanation is allowed. Either the men were reckless, or they were martyrs. Either the company failed them, or the city doomed them no matter what. Real war is rarely that neat. In reality, there are usually layers. The environment can be hostile. The planning can still be insufficient. The men can be brave. The system can still fail them. The ambush can be overwhelming, and leadership decisions can still matter. That complexity is exactly what made Fallujah so explosive in the weeks that followed. The killing of the 4 contractors did not remain just an atrocity. It became a trigger. The United States could not ignore the images from the bridge. The political pressure was immediate. The emotional pressure was immediate. And the Marines were soon ordered toward a response that would become one of the defining urban battles of the Iraq War. This is where the Fallujah ambush stopped being only a contractor story and became a war story. Because what happened to those men helped propel a much larger confrontation between the United States and the city itself. What had been a hostile stronghold was about to become a battlefield in an even more direct sense. There is a brutal logic to insurgent warfare. If you want to provoke a stronger enemy into a costly reaction, you create an outrage too visible to ignore. That is one reading of what Fallujah became. Not just a city of resistance, but a city that understood spectacle. The mutilation of the bodies was not tactically necessary. It was symbolic. It sent a message to Iraqis, to Americans, to the wider world. It said, even here, even now, your power is not absolute. That message landed. For U.S. forces, the attack echoed another memory that still lingered in American military culture. Somalia, Mogadishu, dead Americans in the street. Crowds gathering around bodies. The fear that one image can overpower 1,000 official statements. That one scene can redefine the war in the public mind. That memory mattered. Because armies do not just fight enemies. They also fight comparisons. And no one wanted Iraq to become another story of public humiliation and strategic drift. At the same time, Fallujah presented a military dilemma. Respond too weakly, and you reinforce the image of impotence. Respond too aggressively, and you risk inflaming the city further. That tension would shape what came next. And for a documentary, this is one of the reasons the ambush works so well as a long-form story. It is not just about the deaths, it is about what those deaths set in motion. The men on that convoy were not cabinet officials, they were not generals, they were not widely known public figures. And yet, their killing had consequences far beyond their rank or official status. That is one of the hidden truths of modern war. Sometimes the most historically important people are not the ones with the most power. Sometimes they are the ones who happen to die at exactly the wrong place, at exactly the right time, for everyone else to be forced into reaction. The aftermath also exposed something uncomfortable about the Iraq War itself, namely, how dependent the American project had become on contractors. In the 1991 Gulf War, contractors had been a much smaller part of the deployment structure. By Iraq in 2003 and 2004, they were everywhere. Security, logistics, transport, maintenance, support, all of it increasingly relied on private firms. And yet, the legal and moral framework surrounding those firms remained murky. The Fallujah ambush forced many people to confront that reality. Who exactly were these men? What protections did they have? Who commanded them? Who investigated when they died? Who was accountable when they were sent into danger? The more closely one looked, the messier it became. There were contracts beneath contracts. Questions over whether the mission was connected to KBR-linked logistics work, conflicting public statements, disputes over authorization and support, and hovering over all of it was a larger realization. America had built a war machine that included thousands of armed civilians doing work that the public barely understood. To some, that looked like innovation. To others, it looked like a warning. But whatever one believed, by the spring of 2004, The line between public war and private war had already been crossed, and Fallujah brought that line into full view. There is also something else that makes this story powerful. It is not only strategic, it is personal. Each of the four men had a history before the bridge, a career, a family, motives, complicated motives in some cases. Like many contractors in Iraq, they were not there for one single reason. Some were there because they believed in the mission. Some because they missed the adrenaline and clarity of operational life. Some because the pay was far beyond what many veterans could make back home. Some because private war had become one of the few places where their skill set still commanded immediate value. That is one of the least comfortable truths in the contractor story. For a generation of veterans, private security became both an opportunity and an extension of war itself, an unofficial afterlife of military service. For some men, it was difficult to leave that world behind. The war offered risk, purpose, camaraderie, structure, and the contractor world offered those things, with fewer institutional restraints and much more money. That combination was powerful. It pulled many men back toward places like Iraq, even after their official service had ended. To supporters, that was patriotism, mixed with professionalism. To critics, it was the commercialization of combat. But whichever interpretation one prefers, the men in Fallujah were products of that world. And so was Blackwater.
In many ways, the company was ahead of its time, or perhaps more accurately, it was the natural product of its time, a time when the United States wanted to project power everywhere without always expanding the formal state apparatus required to do it. A time when outsourcing was not seen as exceptional, but efficient. A time when logistics, security, intelligence support, and mobility were increasingly folded into a privatized model. Blackwater did not invent that trend, but it became one of its most visible expressions. And Fallujah was the moment when visibility turned into notoriety. The attack also reinforced a brutal lesson that armies and contractors alike learn in insurgent warfare. Mobility is vulnerability. To move through hostile space is to expose yourself to 1,000 unknowns. Every road is an argument with chance. Every city is a problem in human terrain. And every routine mission carries the possibility of catastrophic miscalculation. The men on that convoy were not heading into a declared battle. That is precisely what makes it so haunting. They were doing the kind of mission that, on paper, can sound almost administrative. Escort, movement, transit, security, the language of management, the language of logistics. But in a place like Fallujah, those words were only a thin layer over violence. And once that thin layer tears, the war underneath becomes visible again. This is one reason why the Fallujah ambush still resonates. Not because it was the deadliest event of the war. It was not. Not because it was militarily decisive on its own. It was not. But because it condensed so many truths of Iraq into one event. The privatization of war, the fragility of control, the speed with which urban hostility can become mass violence, the gap between planning and reality, the strategic power of humiliation, the way a single convoy can change the emotional course of a conflict, and the way four men moving down a road on what should have been a manageable mission can become the center of a global story. Years later, people still argue over the same core questions. Were the men set up to fail, or did they enter a city where any team, no matter how good, could have been destroyed? Did Blackwater move too quickly? Or was this simply the nature of Iraq in 2004? Did the mission reflect negligence?
or the grim compromises of war zones where perfect conditions never exist. And perhaps the hardest question of all, what exactly had Fallujah become by that point? A city in rebellion, a symbol of resistance, a warning to occupiers, a place where the war had finally shed its last illusions. There is no easy answer, and that is exactly why the story works. Because the strongest war stories are not the ones that collapse into slogans. They are the ones that force people to sit with contradictions. Fallujah does that. It forces you to consider courage and misjudgment at the same time, professionalism and chaos at the same time, operational necessity and corporate ambition at the same time. It forces you to look at the modern battlefield and admit that not everyone fighting on it wears a uniform issued by the state, and it forces you to confront the possibility that the Iraq War was already becoming something more fragmented, more privatized, and less controllable than many Americans wanted to believe. In the end, the Fallujah ambush was not just a shocking episode. It was a revelation about the city, a revelation about the insurgency, a revelation about America's dependence on contractors, and a revelation about what happens when war stops being a front line and becomes an ecosystem. Because once war becomes an ecosystem, everything is connected. The military rotation, the logistics contract, the subcontract, the vehicles, the maps, the route, the city's mood, the enemy's planning, the crowd, the cameras, the reaction in Washington, the Marines preparing their response. None of it stands alone. And maybe that is the real lesson of Fallujah. Not simply that 4 Americans were ambushed and killed, but that by March of 2004, the Iraq War had become a machine so complex and so unstable that one convoy moving through one city for one morning could help ignite consequences far beyond the mission itself. That is what gives Fallujah its place in the history of the war. Not only the brutality, not only the imagery, but the chain reaction. And in modern war, chain reactions are often what matter most. Because battles are not always remembered for how they start. Sometimes they are remembered for what they unleash. And Fallujah unleashed far more than a single morning of violence. It exposed the city, it exposed the war, and it exposed the fragile architecture holding America's occupation together. That is why the ambush still matters. Not just as a symbol of barbarity, not just as a symbol of insurgent rage, but as a moment when the Iraq War stopped looking like a controlled intervention and started looking like something much harder to contain. Something improvised, something outsourced, something unstable, and something that could escalate from one convoy to one city to one national trauma in a matter of hours. In that sense, Fallujah was never only about the 4 men on the road. It was about the world around them, the system that sent them, the city that received them, the crowd that gathered, and the country that watched from far away, trying to understand what kind of war this had become. And maybe that is the final reason the story endures, because even now, it still resists simplification. It was not only murder, it was not only miscalculation, it was not only strategy, it was not only chaos. It was all of those things at once. And in modern war, that is often the most uncomfortable truth of all. The events that shape history are rarely clean, rarely linear, rarely easy to explain. They are layered, contradictory, and human. Fallujah was one of those events. And on March 31st, 2004, 4 men entered a city already moving toward a larger explosion. They did not know it yet. But before that day ended, their deaths would become part of something much bigger than the mission they had been sent to complete. Not just an ambush, not just a headline, but a turning point. One of those moments when a war reveals its true face, all at once, and without mercy.